All right, folks, we have a very big PS6 and PS6 portable rumor. This news came out after I was editing LTPS the other night, so I could not put that into the show in time, but we do have the separate upload to go over a lot of very juicy details. This rumor comes courtesy of Moore's Law is Dead over on their YouTube channel, which, as a reminder, they had some very accurate documentation early on for PlayStation 5 Pro, which all lined up quite well, not only with the final console, but them alongside Kepler_L2 on NeoGAF and on Twitter. They've also been very reliable as well with PS5 Pro info, and so what they are both saying about PlayStation 6 so far has been really lining up, and I've heard a few things, really not a ton, so don't take that with much of a giant grain of salt, but really the whole thing, we should always consider that things can change, but there is a lot here that sounds par for the course, I would say, with PlayStation 6, but there is some interesting things in here too. So basically what we've got here is the PS6 codename, which is Orion. This is an alleged 2023 AMD presentation given to Sony. That's what Moore's Law is presenting here, and based on a source that he's spoken to, Sony generally lands on a good portion of the initial proposal with the obvious caveat that things can change. So this is a proposal that AMD gave in 2023. It doesn't mean it's final, but generally what we're hearing is that Sony settles on a good portion of that initial proposal, and they have to lock those things in fairly early for shipping a console years later. So this would be a chipset design, RDNA 5 or UDNA, whatever they end up calling that, based on a 3nm node. Backwards compatibility with PS5 and PS4 software is expected. Moore's Law also went out of their way to say that, or to clarify at least, that PS3 was not mentioned on the documentation. I think that kind of goes without saying. That would probably be emulation. I sincerely doubt we would ever get any sort of onboard PS3 hardware to facilitate PS3 compatibility, but they do want to at least let people know PS3 not in there. But there's a big emphasis on cost constraints and keeping power consumption down. So there's a TDP expected of 160 watts, whereas the fat PS5 from 2020, that would average like 200 something watts during gameplay. PS5 Pro averages 215 watts. The other specs that were presented though, 8 Zen 6 cores, then 40 to 48 RDNA 5 compute units at 3 gigahertz, which they're also theorizing that could potentially be more, but just based on this existing presentation, 40 to 48 CUs. The memory would be GDDR7, rasterization performance would be about 3 times the standard PS5 consoles, and ray tracing is expected to be much higher, around 6 to 7 something times. That's expected to be a much bigger leap, which that does align with the PS5 Pro seminar, where that was closer towards the end of the presentation, with Mark Cerny talking about, low-key talking about next-gen, the Amethyst partnership, and outlining that they expect rasterization to sort of be on the lower end of next-generation leaps. It's really going to be more focused on ray tracing and ML. And so going back to the slide, manufacturing is planned for mid-2027 with a fall 2027 release, or up to early 2028. That's the figure that we're working with so far. And that has been also the timeline given from, if you remember, Kepler-L2, where based on dev kits being sent out and the sort of roadmap for how Sony's looking to ship this thing, it would appear to be 2027, even though we're all kind of thinking that 2028, late 2028 would feel right. It's a 7-year cycle. PS5 came out 2020, so it's still lining up there. So the PS6 handheld, this is codenamed Canis, and this would be a monolithic chip on a 3nm die. Moore's Law claims they were able to verify this from modern documents, and this would also have compatibility with PS5 and PS4 software. But also the handheld itself will sport a micro SD slot, M.2 slot, have haptics, dual microphones, and a touchscreen, and a USB-C port which would have a video out feature, which I think nowadays would be quite crucial. This device would also have a 15-watt TDP, so still pretty modest compared to the other very big, bulky 30-watt handhelds. This thing would be definitely a bit more modest. 12 to 20 RDNA 5 compute units, about 1.6 to 2 gigahertz, and memory is LPDDR5X 7500 or faster. And expected performance would be 0.5 that of a standard PS5 console, about half of a standard PlayStation 5 console, even though ray tracing is expected to be higher than the standard console. And this is also expected to launch fall 2027 or early 2028, potentially very close to PlayStation 6. Moore's Law theorized that maybe it would be like a month after or something, but that was also the same, well, similar-ish timeline we heard from Kepler, in that they weren't entirely sure how Sony was planning to, sort of reveal and launch these products. Maybe it would be a little bit overwhelming to try and ship what are going to be two $500-$600 boxes, or handhelds in this case, right? Two very premium products around the same time. Maybe one comes out first, that's PS6, and then also you get the handheld a few months later, maybe the next quarter or something. Although, realistically speaking, by the time Sony does pull the curtain off this thing, if one is expected mere months away, they would probably outline both of these things around the same time, just that one would launch a little bit after. But definitely some fascinating things to digest here. Now, obviously, specs, if you're not, super privy to those things, and these things can also kind of go over my head. I try to stay on top of it for as much as I reasonably can, but you might, at the very least, on a layman's terms, hear this and think, oh, what does that really mean? And actually, the performance from what we're hearing, based on the spec sheet, which is still a presentation, it's not locked in, always the big caveat we have to keep reminding ourselves of, it might not sound really overly impressive, and it's not when you consider that Sony is planning on potentially really focusing on cost constraints. Now, there's a few things to consider with that as well. What I think is so interesting is that, well, maybe not interesting. This was something I theorized quite a bit ago, which is what we have right now is a semi-awkward circumstance of PlayStation 5 Pro being this low-volume, high-performance box at $700, which was a pretty, at the time, new peak for the console marketplace. But it was still low volume, right? What does that mean for PlayStation 6, which is meant to be higher volume? And Sony traditionally would subsidize the console. They'd be willing to take a loss, or at the least not lose too much money in favor of trying to move a lot of consoles to your standard console buyer, which would mean they likely would not do $700 for PlayStation 6. And that also means they have to phase out PlayStation 5 Pro before PS6 shows up, because that would look very strange to have these two things on the marketplace, and then PS6 shows up rather, and that thing is cheaper than PS5 Pro. Like, obviously that looks a certain type of way. So PS5 Pro might only be relevant for another year or so, and then it will phase out, and then PS6 could potentially be, you would think, $500 to $600. I think it's maybe a safe expectation now to, well, I don't want to say safe, but I think you know what I mean. Based on what we're hearing so far, it would appear as though maybe PlayStation 6 will be priced below PS5 Pro, which is good news. I would think that is the right call there. Now, the other thing to consider, though, is that, yeah, the price would be lower, too, based on the lower wattage. This thing would actually be using less power. They wouldn't be beefing this thing up with crazy specs, and that is to be mindful of not just the console buyer, but also Sony. Actually, my thought immediately was like, oh, okay, so lower wattage, this thing actually would, like, the physical product design would be, I don't want to say much smaller, but it would be smaller than the monolithic PlayStation 5 we had in 2020, which was laughed at for being as big as it was, and even PS5 Pro is still a fairly large console, all things considered. This sounds like, as far as the product design goes, would be, a semi-modest sized box, which that goes into fulfillment, shipping, the weight, and moving these consoles overseas. And there's obviously still economic uncertainties with tariffs and the administration that they may or may not be dealing with by 2028 and beyond. There's just still so many unknowns. So it would make sense that they want to be very mindful of these things. And also with lower power consumption, based on whenever they end up deploying PlayStation 6 server blades, that would also be very important as well, given that one of the highest running costs for a data center is basically that, energy and cooling and storage and all the sort of verticals that come with that business. But yeah, PS6, I mean, I think that would actually also be the right call. I don't know if it sounds disappointing based on the specs, but you have to consider that the thing is going to I would presume, be heavily prioritized on the ML and ray tracing side. Potentially, we might see some path tracing games. And I still have no doubt that PS6 will actually be able to sort of position itself in a way that is arguably very hard to do when we have diminishing returns. You look at this console, you look at the spec sheet, and you think that might not be a very big leap, but with ML kicking in, possibly some path tracing games. I think visually there will be a certain identity to PS6 software that might not be mind-blowing, but I think it would be there. And there's also a lot to be said about, you know, the UI, for example, how Sony loves to always make a brand new UI for every single console cycle, and there's a lot of quality of life features and things they could do there which would make it feel like a more premium next-gen leap above PlayStation 5, arguably speaking. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing to think of is backwards compatibility, which I think for any consumer you would safely expect PS4 and 5 software should play. You hear the CU count on this machine, though. If it's not anything higher than PS5 Pro, you would think that breaks backwards compatibility. Now, this would also go way over my head, so, you know, who am I to say? But based on the fact that these are RDNA 5 CUs that have a much higher threshold and performance above the CU count that PS5 Pro has, I would think that's enough to sort of overcompensate based on, well, previously how Sony used to do backwards compatibility, where it had to evenly divide against the CU count of, well, this would have been like PS4 Pro and PS4, and how PS5 also, you know, downclock. So that's the whole thing there that I'm not super good at explaining, but at least how I understand it, that previously would have been an issue. I guess it might not be here. So that's what PS6 looks like right now. The handheld, rather, is interesting, right? The thing is, we might have a very big smoking gun with this current PS5 firmware that we're on right now, or the one that we're in beta on right now. The feature is not accessible, but low power mode is now on the console, and when that feature is turned on for everybody when this firmware goes live, we will be able to see just how much wattage that thing gets cut down to, and if it's in half, that will, I think, very clearly telegraph that the low power mode is there primarily for the handheld, even though, yes, Sony does have environmental targets trying to reach net zero by fiscal year 2040. You know, they can obviously say that all day, every day publicly, but when we have this consumer-facing low power mode feature that we can test in real-world terms and see it cuts the wattage in half, and this handheld, from a rumor, mind you, is positioned as 0.5 performance of PlayStation 5. What does that tell you? So for any sort of doubters right now about Sony building two SoCs, one of them being for a local play handheld, well, a lot of these things are lining up in a way that is that's very hard to ignore. Let's just say that. The other thing is that the handheld might seem like a very big gap between PlayStation 6, because if it's 0.5 PS5, PS6 is going to be 3 times rasterization from PlayStation 5. You think, like, okay, well, if they mandate software support so every single PS6 game from there onward has to have a, you know, performance profile for this handheld, does that hold back the generation in a very similar fashion to what we saw with Series S during this cycle, which, really important to clarify, that was, you know, not a small amount of games, but it was uncommon. Some developers were definitely a lot more forthcoming with airing out their frustrations, having to make a Series S profile, and a lot of that came down to a memory budget. It really depended on the size and scope of each particular game. Certainly wasn't everything, obviously, but still, would we see something like that when Sony mandates support for a handheld that's 0.5 performance of a PlayStation 5 with PS6 at the same time, and that thing's 3 times the rasterization performance of PlayStation 5 standard consoles? You see the gap there. The thing I would always posit here is that there's a difference in frame timing that both these devices are expecting. Games are very scalable nowadays. Again, it is still highly dependent on scope and budget and whatever a studio is trying to accomplish, but I think it's really important to always remember here that one console is conceivably going to be targeting 4K 120 for, you know, I would say a lot of games coming out on PlayStation 6, and the other is 1080 60, and those games internally can run lower than 1080 because PSSR, FSR4 level performance, frame gen, all these things are going to play a very big role in helping these devices reach near native image qualities. They don't have to be native necessarily, obviously. So to get those image qualities up to 1080 on the handheld or 4K 120 on PS6, I mean, I think that kind of goes without saying. You're seeing a 8-something times difference on the frame budget. It might seem like a very big gap, but it's really important to remember what exactly each device has to target. So I think the mandate wouldn't necessarily be as problematic as some would think, especially given, and this is also the thing that we really got to beat home here, the amount of studios that can even make 9-figure games reliably within a reasonable time frame, which games now take 5, 6, 7, 8 something years to make, and those type of studios are very few and far between. I mean, we've hit diminishing returns. I don't think we have to be necessarily that concerned with PlayStation 6 not being able to be crazy powerful and be hampered down by a handheld. I think we're all kind of in this landscape of these games that are super scalable, and there's only a handful of outliers that might want to really push the boundaries, sure, but I think we're kind of past that point. There's more of a shortage on those type of games versus the vast majority of experiences that we could be having on PS6 and also the handheld as well. So that's about it for me on this one. All the stuff sounds very it sounds genuine. I mean, again, like it's a presentation that AMD presented to Sony. Nothing is locked in, but based on everything we've heard so far, based on what I've heard, based on what I know, and again, I don't know a ton, but this all sounds about right, and it also sounds like the right play. I'm not going to shy away from the idea of I think it's so exciting to have a local play handheld that would allow you to play PS4, 5, and 6 software. I think the Portal's great, but I want local play, and this would be a very premium device with no compromises for developers when you log in and your 4 and 5 library is going to launch on this thing. That's fantastic news, and then you don't have to worry about new software coming out because there will be a performance profile for that handheld. And PlayStation 6, I mean, it sounds like it will be a semi-affordable device during a very economic, uncertain times. This sounds good to me. I mean, I'm generally optimistic, so I mean, you can always chalk it up to that, but all this PS6 stuff that we're hearing about so far, and we typically do hear these things about 2 years out from when the console is ready to launch, I think we're starting to see this stuff really ramp up, and we'll be getting more and more PS6 rumors as we go into the later half of this year, and certainly 2026 as well. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. You take it easy.